The silence in the cave was deep, endless. Zuba's breath echoed against the stone wall. She turned slowly, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then she felt it. Not the chill of the night, not the stillness of stones, but a presence. A cold hand brushed against her cheek, not of flesh, but of air, of memory, of something that was and was not. And then a whisper, soft as fallen leaves, heavy as thunder. You have come at last. Zuba's heart pounded. Who are you? She breathed, though deep down she already knew. The shadow moved, and before her, a figure took shape. A girl no older than herself, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes hollow pools of darkness. Zuba's voice trembled. You are the spirit child. The ghost tilted her head as if amused. I was once called Nyana. Zuba swallowed. They killed you. The spirit eyes flickered, like the last embers of a dying fire. Yes, she did. A silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then Yana stepped closer, her voice cold as the grave. I have waited in the dark, forgotten by the world, but now they will remember. Zuba shivered. What must I do? She whispered. Yana's ghostly figure brushed against Zuba's forehead, sending a chill through her, and in that instant, images flooded Zuba's mind. The night Yana was taken, the hands that held her down, the blade that ended her life, the faces of those who feasted upon her flesh. Zuba gasped, stumbling backward, her hands clutching her chest. The king, she choked out. He has eaten. Yana's whisper cut through the air, sharp as a blade. Yes, and now he belongs to the dead. Zuba stared at her, realization crashing down like a wave. King Ezanga had not been consuming mere meat. He had been consuming a curse, and soon the curse will claim him. Inside the great stone palace, King Ezanga sat alone in his chamber, staring into the bronze mirror before him. He did not recognize the face that stared back. His skin was paler, his eyes darker, sunken like a man who had not slept for many months. Sweat clung to his brow, yet his body felt cold. His stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with something deeper, darker, something wrong. Since the last feast, his dreams had become nightmares. He saw faces in the dark, whispers in the walls, and now, as he gazes at his reflection, his lips parted, his tongue flickering out, longer than it should be. He recalled, shaking his head. Is it the wine? He muttered, or the heaviness of my mind? He turned away, but the whispers followed. Did you forget me? His breath caught. He spun around. The mirror was empty. But the whisper was real. Ezanga's hand clenched the edge of his throne, his mind unraveling like frayed cloth. Something was coming for him, and for the first time in his reign, King Ezanga felt fear. Zuba ran through the village streets. Her feet were bare against the dust. The wind howled around her, carrying the voices of spirits that only she could hear. Yana's whisper echoed in her ears. The king feasted on my death, and now the dead will feast on him. She needed to tell her grandmother. She needed to tell the elders. She needed to warn Busongora before it was too late. But before she reached the elders' compound, a strong hand clamped onto her arms, only to see the chief priest standing before her. His face was green, his eyes knowing. Come, child, he said, voice deep with urgency. I have seen it too. Inside the temple, flames flickered in clay balls, casting long shadows on the mud walls. The chief priest stood before Zuba, his face etched with worry. I have waited for this moment, he murmured. Zuba frowned. You knew? She asked. He nodded slowly. The meat seller's secret was buried, but the spirit never forgets. And now, the time has come for the truth to rise. Zuba's chest tightened. What do we do? The chief priest took a deep breath. The king must be warned, but he is surrounded by the wrong men. If we are not careful, they will silence us before we speak. Zuba clenched her fist. Then we must be faster than their shadows. The chief priest looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Tomorrow, we go to the palace. Elsewhere in the darkness of Busongora, Waziri stood beneath an ancient fig tree with the three meat sellers before him, Bakari, Sefu, and Nia. Their faces were unreadable, their hands red with unseen sins. The girl has spoken to the spirit, Waziri said, his voice low and urgent. Nia's eyes narrowed. Then she is more dangerous than we thought. Bakari's jaw tightened. She will not leave the palace alive. Waziri's gaze flickered towards the towering stone walls in the distance. Neither will the king if the curse takes its full course. Nia's sleep curled into a slow smile. Then let us watch him fall. And as the night deepened, the spirit stared, hungry for justice. The sun rose over Busongora like a dying ember. Inside the great palace, King Izanga sat on his throne, his body rigid, his fingers gripping the lion-carved armrest. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, and his once powerful frame seemed to shrink within his robes. The whispers had not stopped. They called in the corners of his chambers, murmured in the folds of his bed, slithered through the grand halls like serpents unseen. Did you forget me? The voice was always the same, soft, haunting female. Izanga pressed his trembling hands against his temples. No, he whispered hoarsely, I did not forget. The palace gates yawned open, and through them stepped Zuba and the chief priest. The guards, tall and unmoving, hesitated only briefly before allowing them inside. The king had summoned the chief priest many times before, but the girl, barefoot and dressed in the simple clothes of a villager, was an unfamiliar sight within these grand walls. She felt the weight of the palace upon her shoulder, the towering pillars, the thick air, but Zuba did not tremble. Her grandmother's words echoed in her heart. Fear belongs to those who do not know the truth, and Zuba knew the truth now. She walked with purpose, her chin high, though her fingers clenched the charms hidden in her wrist. The spirits were watching. Inside the great hall, King Izanga sat, surrounded by his advisors, warriors and chiefs. Waziri stood at the right side, his face unreadable. The moment Zuba and the chief priest stepped forward, the air in the room shifted. Tension, suspicion, something more. The king's sunken eyes flickered towards them. Why do you come? His voice was hoarse, lacking the force it once carried. The chief priest bowed deeply, his robes brushing the floor. Great king, he said, we bring you a truth buried in the bones of the past, a truth that calls from the spirit world. A murmur spread through the room. The king frowned. The spirit world? His fingers twitched. He did not want to hear of spirit. He did not want to hear their voices. But the whisper had already begun again, coiling around his ears. Did you forget me? His jaws clenched. Speak! The chief priest motioned to Zuba. She took a breath, stepping forward, a small figure before the throne of a mighty king. I have seen her, she said. The spirit of the girl who was taken, the one whose flesh was. Waziri caught in sharply. This is madness, he hollowed, stepping forward, all eyes turned on him. My king, why do you allow a mere child to speak of dark things in your halls? These are the words of fools, meant to stir fear. Zuba did not flinch. Instead, she raised her chin and met the king's gaze. You have eaten her, my king, she said, her voice unwavering. And now, she eats away at you. The halls fell silent. The king stiffened, his breath sharp, his lips parting. But before he could speak, the torches flickered, the shadows deepened, and a cold wind swept through the chamber. And then a soft voice. Did you forget me? The room froze. The voice did not belong to Zuba, nor to the chief priest, nor to any living soul in the room. It came from the air itself. The king's fingers shook. The courtiers glanced around, their faces pale. The spirit was here, and she was watching. For the first time, Waziri's mask cracked. The confidence in his posture wavered, just for a breath, and then in the next instant, he acted. Seize them, he roared. The guards hesitated. Now! The warriors rushed forward, hands outstretched to grab Zuba and the chief priest. Zuba's heart pounded, but she did not move. She did not need to, because in that moment, The great doors of the palace flew open with a wail. A wind howled through the hall. The torches sputtered, and the air became thick with the presence of something unseen. And then, from the entrance, a shape began to form. A girl, pale as the moon, her eyes hollow as the abyss, her hair floating like smoke. The spirit child had come. The King Ezanga began to scream. The courtiers pressed against the walls, their eyes wide with terror as the spirit girl took form. She was not of flesh, yet she was there. Her skin pale like the moonlight river, her eyes hollow pools of darkness. She did not walk, she floated. She had returned for the one who had feasted on her stolen flesh, returned for vengeance. King Ezanga's breath came in rage gasps. His body convulsed, his fingers digging into his own arms as if trying to hold himself together. His once golden crown fell like a shackle of fire upon his brow. His throne, once mighty, now seemed a prison. The whisper had grown louder, no longer soft murmurs but wails, voices rising through the underworlds from the depth of forgotten bones. You called for me, the voice chilled his soul. You feasted on me, his throat tightened. You made me a servant of the dead. Now I call for you. The spirit's face remained calm, but her eyes burned with something that belonged to neither the living nor the dead. The king tried to rise, tried to speak, to command, to deny, but his limbs refused him. The spirit had bound him in his own flesh. The courtiers shrank back, terrified, but Waziri stepped forward, not in courage, not in loyalty, but in desperation. This is witchcraft, he roared, a trick of the old priest, a deception by the cursed girl. Zuba's eyes burned with defiance. My king, do not listen to them. His hands trembled, but his voice carried the arrogance of a man who had long walked in the shadows. The courtiers clung to silence, their faces pale with fear. The king, still bowed by the weight of the unseen, could not answer. And then the spirit child shifted her gaze. She turned to Waziri. You! A single word, soft as falling rain, yet heavier than judgment of the ancestors. Zuba's breath caught. She knew the truth was about to be revealed. The spirit voice carried across the hall, weaving through the ears of those who had long forgotten or chosen to forget. You were there! Gasps ripped through the court. The mask of Busongora's most trusted advisor had begun to crack. You led them to me. King Ezanga's gaze snapped to Waziri, confusion fighting against the grip of terror. You? Waziri stiffened, his mind racing. This was not how it was supposed to happen. This was not the plan. His face twisted, and then, like a wounded beast, he lashed out. Lies, he roared. But even as he spoke, his own shadow twisted on the floor, stretching unnaturally darkening. The spirit was binding him to his own sins. You gave me to the butchers, she whispered. You whispered to them the path to take. You guided their hands in the dark. Waziri staggered back, his once steady frame now trembling. No, no! But the truth had been spoken. The shadows would not let him go. The palace was silent, save for the king's rage breath. His mind twisted, caught between the denial and realization. His most trusted advisor, the traitor, the man who had whispered in his ears, guided his decisions, poisoned his judgment, a murderer. The spirit child's voice softened, but her presence grew heavier. King Ezanga, you have eaten the flesh of the innocent. You have feasted while the dead have starved, but now you must choose. The king's lips trembled. Choose? The spirit nodded, yes. The dead call for justice. Will you answer them? Silence embroiled the palace, a moment of reckoning. Would King Ezanga face the darkness he had ignored? Would he undo the wrongs of the past, or would he fall further into the pit that had already swallowed so many? Zuba watched. The courtiers waited. The spirit held their breath. The fate of the land of Busongora hung in the air. King Ezanga sat frozen on his throne, his body heavy as stone, his heart heavier still. He had known betrayal in his lifetime, warriors who had abandoned the battlefield, chiefs who had sold their loyalty for gold. But this was the deepest cult, his most trusted advisor, his right-hand man. The man who had guided his steps, whispered in his ears, shaped his role. The very man who had led the butchers to the spirit child. The voice in his mind returned, no longer just the whispers of the dead, but the echoes of his own choices. You have eaten the flesh of the innocent. You have feasted while the dead have starved. You have sat upon a throne built on forgotten bones. The spirit child drifted closer to Waziri, her voice like wind passing through an empty valley. You fed me to the darkness, she said. Now the darkness calls for you. The shadows at Waziri's feet called together, creeping up his legs. He screamed, thrashing, but the darkness only tightened its grip. The courtiers pressed against the walls, eyes daring between the king and the doomed advisor. Fear clung to them like damp clothes. Zuba watched in silence, her small hands clenched at her side. This was justice, but it was not yet complete. The spirit child turned her hollow eyes back to the king. And you, king of Busongora, Ezanga's breath caught. You sit upon the throne carved by the hands of my murderers. You have ruled with the guidance of a traitor. Tell me, what is your judgment? The weight of the question pressed upon him, heavier than the golden crown upon his brow. He looked at Waziri, the man he had trusted above all others, a man who had whispered in his ears, a man who had led him to ruin, a man who had deceived him. The king's hands tightened into fist. He would not be made a fool again. His voice, though hoarse but unsteady, rose above the silence. Waziri has betrayed me. He has betrayed the kingdom. He has betrayed the spirits themselves. A murmur rippled through the room. Let him suffer the fate he sought to escape. A shudder ran through Waziri's body. No, my king, my brother, listen to me. I did what I did for you, for the throne, for the strength of Busongora. The king's face remained hard. You did it for yourself. With those words, the shadows rose like a flood. Waziri's screams shattered through the hall, but it did not last long. The darkness swallowed him whole. And then he was gone. Not a trace remained. The spirit child turned back to Ezanga, her gaze unreadable. The courtiers watched in stern silence, the weight of what they had witnessed settling in their bones. Zuba took a step forward, her young voice firm. The spirits have taken their due, she said. But the throne is stained. King Ezanga did not argue. His knees buckled. For the first time in his life, he fell from the throne, not by force, but by the weight of the truth. His crown tilted, nearly slipping from his head. What must I do? He whispered. The spirit child watched him for a long moment. Then she began to fade, her form dissolving into mist, her voice carrying like the last breath of a dying wind. Remember me! And with that, she was gone. The night was silent. The spirits had taken their justice, but Busongora would never be the same. The land of Busongora stood eerie quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Waziri was gone, swallowed by the darkness he had long embraced. King Ezanga knelt upon the cold stone, his head bowed, his crown slipping from his brow. The weight of the truth had bent him. The courtiers who had once sung of his praises and laughed at his feet stood frozen. They had seen what they would never have seen. The spirit had walked among them, the dead had spoken, and their king had been humbled before their eyes. In the silence, one voice remained unshaken. Zuba, the child of vision. She took a step forward, small yet unafraid, young yet burdened with ancient wisdom. The spirits have taken their dues, she said, her voice clear as the wind before the storm. But the throne of Busongora is not yet cleansed. Ezanga lifted his head. His face was weary, lined not with age, but with the weight of realization. What more do you ask of me? He murmured. Zuba held his gaze, unblinking. To remember the girl who was taken, the child who was devoured by greed and power, the innocent who became a servant of the dead. Her words were a blade, slicing through the remains of his pride. For too long, the land of Busongora has feasted on the sufferings of others. For too long, you have ruled with closed eyes and deaf ears. The courtiers stared, their discomfort evident. They had played their part in this ignorance, but Zuba's gaze remains locked on the king. O king, you cannot undo the past, but you can change what is to come.